recently learned that several of my rabbinic colleagues, particularly in Canada, open every worship service and program with a land affirmation statement. Now, I didn't know what that was, so I looked it up. The U.S. Department of Arts and Culture, not a government entity, but a people-powered department, a grassroots action network, says that in countries like New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and among tribal nations in the U.S., it is commonplace, even policy, to open events and gatherings by acknowledging the traditional indigenous inhabitants of the land. While some individuals and educational institutions in the United States have adopted this custom, the vast majority have not. Closer to home, the University of Arkansas Fulbright College of Arts and Sciences offers this land acknowledgement. The indigenous history of the land the University of Arkansas campus sits on goes back to time immemorial. And across that expanse of time, many successive groups have lived here and created sacred legacies in this area. Fulbright College acknowledges indigenous peoples were forced to leave their ancestral lands, including the Osage, Caddo, and Quapaw nations with ties to Northwest Arkansas. We further recognize that a portion of the Trail of Tears runs through our campus, and that the Cherokee, Choctaw, Muskogee or Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole nations passed through what is now Arkansas during the forced removal. Torah is replete with land acknowledgement statements. When Abraham and Sarah first arrive in the Promised Land, we are reminded, at that time, Canaanites were present in the land. Then, when God promises the land to Abraham and Sarah's descendants, God describes it as the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Casmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. This Shabbat, we read Parashat Chayei, which begins with Sarah's death in Hebron. Abraham interrupts his grief to secure a grave for his wife. He approaches the Hittites, the native people there, describing himself humbly as a foreigner living for a time among you. Abraham refrains from declaring the land to be his, promised by God. Even though the Hittites offer Abraham a burial place at no charge, Abraham insists on paying full price for his chosen spot. The Hebrew Bible later records numerous occasions when, at God's command, the Israelites make war, sometimes brutally, to take land from indigenous nations by force. Never, though, is the presence of indigenous peoples denied. Indeed, history records no time when our people held the land of Israel exclusively. Indigenous peoples have also been present. One may well ask why my Canadian colleagues, alongside small but increasing numbers of U.S. Reform rabbis, are beginning services and programs with land acknowledgement statements. Nobody alive today is responsible for dispossessing American Indians of their lands. Moreover, after World War II, Congress created the Indian Claims Commission to pay compensation to any federally recognized tribe for land that had been seized by the United States. Unfortunately, the New York Times article describing those reparations goes on to acknowledge that the government took a paternalistic view and kept Native Americans from having direct control of the funds in the belief that they were not competent to receive such large amounts of money. Our Jewish values demand that we wrestle with the claims that American Indians have on us as beneficiaries of past injustices. In particular, I would lift up the sole trait of truth from the Musar tradition. Alan Marinus writes of the great rabbi, Hillel says that we need to challenge ourselves to see truth not only through our own eyes, but also through the eyes of another person who is tied to the situation. Too often, American history has been told only through the experience of European Americans. Most of us learned in school that Columbus discovered America in 1492, and that Vikings had likely done so centuries earlier. The truth, of course, told not only through our eyes, but also through those of American Indians, is that America was inhabited millennia before 1492. Sophisticated cultures had developed and flowered long before Europeans set foot on American continents. The discovery doctrine, that is, the notion that America was discovered by Europeans, is a form of white supremacy, which is the reason why the self-styled U.S. Department of Arts and Culture argues that land acknowledgement statements support larger truth-telling and reconciliation efforts. As we affirm our debts to American Indians, we may also increasingly sensitize ourselves to the often unacknowledged contributions of Black Americans and of immigrants from throughout the Southern Hemisphere to this great country we have inherited. Humility is another value we may practice as we acknowledge Indigenous people. When we recognize that the land on which we live is not ours alone, we may approach American plains and mountains, rivers and lakes with greater humility, taking less and preserving more. We may not be ready to begin each of our programs and services with a land acknowledgement statement, if for no other reason than that doing so would single out one example of oppression and white supremacy, sidelining many others. Still, this Thanksgiving, as we gather around our pandemic-modified Thanksgiving tables, we can do better than to extol the mythologized first Thanksgiving. What really happened? Voice of America reports in the fall of 1621, the Pilgrims celebrated their first successful harvest by firing guns and cannons in Plymouth, Massachusetts. The noise alarmed ancestors of the contemporary Wampanoag Indians who went to investigate. That is how Native people came to be present at the first Thanksgiving. Paintings depicting Native Americans sitting down for a bountiful and harmonious meal with colonial families is basically a lie. Native Americans today observe Thanksgiving as a day of mourning, given the rapid colonization and displacement of their people, or they gather with their families, but the Pilgrims aren't on their minds. We need not observe Thanksgiving as a day of mourning. We can, however, assure that American Indians, the real people, not the mythologized ones, are on our minds. We would do well to begin our Thanksgiving dinners with the University of Arkansas's land acknowledgement statement. Then may we approach this blessed land with truth and humility. Then may we approach the land and the people who were here before us, as Abraham did in his own promised land. Then may we commit ourselves to being a blessing in America. Amen.